France, 1880. The working day runs between 10 and 16 hours. Children work factory floors. There are no protections, no sick pay, no pension. Poverty is not a risk. It is the condition. The labor movement has one answer to all of it: the 8-hour day. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of your own time. That is the demand. That is what workers are organizing for, striking for, being imprisoned for. Into that world, one man looked at the fight and said it was the wrong fight entirely. His name was Paul Lafargue. Lafargue was born on January 15th, 1842, in Santiago de Cuba. His father owned coffee plantations. The family had money. Each of Lafargue's 4 grandparents came from a different ethnic and religious background: French Christian, Haitian Creole, French Jewish, and Taino. His grandmother, on his father's side, had fled Hispaniola during the Haitian Revolution, part of roughly 20,000 civilians who crossed to Cuba in those years. In 1851, when Paul was 9, the family left Cuba for Bordeaux. Some historians have attributed the move to the tightening repression of black and mixed-race families on the island in the aftermath of a failed independence expedition. Paul finished school in Toulouse. He went to Paris to study medicine. He didn't finish. In 1865, he attended a socialist gathering and was expelled from the French university system for it. He left for London, where he completed his medical degree, and where, at a house in North London, he met Karl Marx. Lafargue became a regular visitor, then a political collaborator, then the husband of Marx's second daughter, Laura. They married in April 1868 at St. Pancras Registry Office. Both Marx and Friedrich Engels were witnesses. He was now family. And within a few years, that relationship would produce one of the most quoted lines in the history of socialist thought, not written in admiration. Marx was not an easy man, and Lafargue was not a careful one. The tension between them ran through their entire relationship. Marx believed in precision, in rigorous analysis, in the slow accumulation of evidence, in saying exactly what you could prove. Lafargue was a polemicist. He moved fast and hit hard and sometimes got ahead of the argument. Shortly before Marx's death in 1883, he wrote a letter to both Lafargue and French Workers' Party leader Jules Guesde, both of whom claimed to represent Marxist principles. Marx accused them of revolutionary phrasemongering, of making radical noise without the analytical substance to back it up. That exchange, as reported by Engels, is what produced the line, "What is certain is that I am not a Marxist." Marx was talking about Lafargue and Guesde specifically. The line became universal. There is another layer to this relationship that is harder to discuss, but necessary. Marx and Engels, in their private correspondence, repeatedly referred to Lafargue using a racial slur. Lucy Sante, in her introduction to the 2022 New York Review Books edition of Lafargue's work, documents this plainly. The men who built the theoretical framework of international labor solidarity wrote about their own mixed-race son-in-law in language that belongs to the history of European racism. Lafargue's text, in turn, contains anti-Semitic passages, primarily using the Rothschild family as a stand-in for finance capital in ways that were commonplace in European socialist writing of the period, but are not defensible by the fact of their commonness. The irony that Lafargue was himself 1/4 Jewish by ancestry has not been lost on scholars. Historian Simon Hanna, writing in Anti-Capitalist Resistance, put it directly. Lafargue's pamphlet contains a genuine challenge to the culture of overwork, but its flaws are real and shouldn't be smoothed over. The text has to be read as a historical document, sharp in its central argument, compromised in its execution. What Lafargue actually wrote, and why it spread the way it did, requires understanding the world he was writing into. France in 1880 was an industrial society in full acceleration. The working day ran between 10 and 16 hours. Child labor was ordinary. There were no meaningful protections against dismissal, no sick pay, no pension, no weekend in any modern sense. The organized labor movement's answer to these conditions was the campaign for an 8-hour day, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of personal time. That was the demand. That was what tens of thousands of workers were organizing and striking and being imprisoned to achieve. Lafargue thought they were aiming at the wrong target entirely. As historian Leslie Derfler wrote in his biography, Paul Lafargue, and the founding of French Marxism, Lafargue believed the labor movement had absorbed the values of the class it was supposed to be fighting. Workers had been so thoroughly shaped by the ethics of industrial capitalism, by the moral equation of labor with virtue, of idleness with sin, that they could not conceive of demanding anything beyond a more bearable version of their own exploitation. Derfler's analysis is that for Lafargue, the 8-hour campaign wasn't a stepping stone, it was a ceiling, and it was a ceiling the workers had built for themselves. That diagnosis drove the pamphlet. He first laid it out in 1880 in the pages of L'Égalité. 3 years later, serving time in Saint-Pélagie prison for a socialist speech, he revised it and published it as a book. The Right to be Lazy opens without preamble. A strange delusion possesses the working classes of the nations where capitalist civilization holds its sway. This delusion drags in its train the individual and social woes which for 2 centuries have tortured sad humanity. This delusion is the love of work, the furious passion for work, pushed even to the exhaustion of the vital force of the individual and his progeny. Instead of opposing this mental aberration, the priests, the economists, and the moralists have cast a sacred halo over work. The argument that follows moves from that premise outward. The love of work, Lafargue contends, is not a natural condition. It is manufactured, instilled by a system that requires workers to compete for the opportunity to generate profit and to experience that competition as personal dignity. The worker who takes pride in his output, who volunteers extra hours, who demands the right to work rather than the right to rest, has done the employer's work for him. The machines complicate this further. Lafargue wrote, "In proportion as the machine is improved and performs man's work with an ever-increasing rapidity and exactness, the laborer, instead of prolonging his former rest times, redoubles his ardor, as if he wished to rival the machine. Oh, absurd and murderous competition! The logic of industrial capitalism, he argues, means that every productivity gain is converted not into leisure, but into additional output. The machine does not free the worker. It raises the bar the worker is expected to clear. This produces a crisis of overproduction, more goods than can be consumed, which the system resolves by manufacturing new desires, new needs, new categories of want. The worker produces more, consumes more, and works more to afford what he consumes. The cycle is self-sealing. His demand in response to all of this was specific. Limit the working day to 3 hours, not 8. 3. Use the machines for what they were built to do, and let the remaining hours of the day belong to the people living them. He closed the pamphlet with a line that was designed to offend every instinct that industrial capitalism had spent a century cultivating. O laziness, mother of the arts and noble virtues, be thou the balm of human anguish. He meant it as a declaration, not a joke. And in the context of what the labor movement was actually fighting for in 1880, that declaration was a direct challenge, not just to the employers, but to his own side. The 8-hour movement was radical by the standards of 1880. It faced violent opposition. Workers were imprisoned for organizing around it. Lafargue's position was that it was not radical enough, and that its insufficiency was not accidental. By accepting the framework of the right to work, labor organizers had conceded the central premise of the system they were challenging, that wage labor was a legitimate arrangement requiring reform rather than an exploitative structure requiring abolition. You do not, Lafargue argued, demand the right to be enslaved more comfortably. You demand to be free. This put him at odds not just with the establishment, but with most of the organized left, including, in meaningful ways, Marx himself. Marx still operated within a framework where labor was a central category of human life and historical progress. Lafargue was willing to discard that framework entirely. He had also, by that point, spent 20 years building the political structures meant to act on that conviction. In 1880, the same year Lafargue began publishing The Right to be Lazy in the pages of the socialist newspaper L'Égalité, he co-founded the Parti Ouvrier Français, France's first Marxist political party, alongside Jules Guesde. The party's program was drafted with direct contributions from Marx, Engels, Guesde, and Lafargue. Marx wrote the preamble himself. Lafargue won a seat in the Chamber of Deputies. He wrote on literature, economics, and religion. He was, for 3 decades, a significant and sometimes chaotic presence in European socialist politics. Friedrich Engels, who funded the Lafargues for much of their lives, and whose estate they partially inherited when he died in 1895, described Lafargue's political management in terms that were less than flattering. In the negotiations over founding the Parti Ouvrier Français in 1880, Engels wrote that Lafargue had committed blunder after blunder and nearly collapsed the entire effort. In 1889, when Lafargue was tasked with organizing the founding conference of the Second International in Paris, Engels wrote that he was making a terrible hash of things. The ideas were sharper than the execution. In the last years of his life, Lafargue withdrew. He and Laura settled in the village of Draveil, outside Paris. He wrote occasional articles. He corresponded with Karl Kautsky, Karl Liebknecht, and the young Vladimir Lenin, who had visited him in Paris in 1895. The movement went on without him. On November 25, 1911, Paul and Laura Lafargue were found dead at their home in Draveil. Paul was 69, Laura was 66. Both had been in good health. He had left a note expressing his wish to end his life on his own terms, before old age could strip him of his faculties and make him a burden to others. He died nearly penniless. His estate left just enough for his funeral, and $100 to his gardener, Ernest Doucet. They buried Paul and Laura Lafargue at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Division 76, near the Communards' Wall. Vladimir Lenin spoke at the funeral as a representative of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Jean Jaurès spoke. Keir Hardie spoke. The reaction across the European left was not uniformly admiring. As historian Susan Watkins wrote in the London Review of Books, the deaths shocked the left and dimmed his reputation in the decades after. The working day in most wealthy countries today is 8 hours. That is the ceiling the labor movement fought for in the 1880s. The demand Lafargue called a capitulation. The productivity gains of the past century and a half, mechanization, electrification, computing, automation, have not, in the main, produced shorter working weeks. They have produced more output, higher consumption, and roughly the same hours at work, or more. Lafargue's description of a system that converts every efficiency gain into new production rather than new leisure, and that manufactures artificial needs to absorb what workers have exhausted themselves making, is not a historical curiosity. It is a description of the present. He was not a clean figure. The contradictions in his life and his text are real. The son of a coffee planter who theorized wage labor as slavery. The quarter-Jewish writer with anti-Semitic passages in his most famous work. The political organizer whom his own allies described as a persistent liability. He was also the man who, in 1880, wrote that the greatest trick capitalism had pulled was convincing the people it was consuming that their consumption was their virtue. That argument did not expire with him. Our epoch has been called the century of work, Lafargue wrote. It is in fact the century of pain, misery, and corruption. He was writing about the 19th century. The question of which century he was actually describing is one the viewer can answer for themselves.